After 2 years, a bit of fighting and an incredibly tense bombardment, the Gaza Strip is governed by a desperately needed ceasefire. The last of the living hostages held by the Hamas organization have been returned to Israel. Humanitarian aid has been allowed to flood into the Gaza Strip, and the nations of the world have organized an all-out diplomatic push to ensure that this is the last time that a Gaza ceasefire ever has to be negotiated. Right now, in Israel, Gaza, and all across the globe, there is genuine hope that this crisis could be over, and that whatever comes out of an eventual accord, it'll leave the Middle East more stable, more prosperous, and more peaceful than it was before the war. But unfortunately, that's not the whole story. Right now, a growing chorus of international experts are warning that the Gaza conflict is far from a settled issue, and that the overwhelming pressures that both sides have to deal with risk crumbling the ceasefire deal before it can be converted into a permanent peace. Already the truce is starting to crack under the strain. Israeli bombs are dropping again across Gaza. Hamas has kicked off violent internal crackdowns, and the flow of international aid has already been temporarily cut off. Each side is refusing to compromise on demands that the other cannot accept, and the divide between Israel and Hamas's positions isn't shrinking, it's getting bigger. Now, make no mistake, we here at WarFronts and the vast majority of global experts sounding the alarm would really like to be wrong about where this ceasefire is headed. But right now, Israel and Hamas do not appear to be on track to reach a permanent peace. Unless something changes fast, the ceasefire is headed for a breakdown. A shaky situation. Okay, to understand the situation in Gaza today, we first have to understand a much broader rule in global affairs. A ceasefire is a ceasefire because all parties agree that it is a ceasefire. As we're going to explain, both Israel and Hamas have already engaged in actions that could very reasonably be interpreted as a direct breach of the ceasefire arrangement as written, and yet as of today, the ceasefire is still holding. Although it's certainly not a good thing when either side violates the agreement, the mere fact that occasional violations are happening does not mean that the ceasefire has failed. Those violations can be addressed, terms of a deal can be strengthened or changed, and both sides are capable of deciding to continue the ceasefire even if it's been put under strain. Whether it's in Gaza or anywhere else, a ceasefire only fails when one or both sides of the conflict decide, for whatever reason, that they're no longer going to constrain or adjust their behavior to align with the terms of a truce. As the time of writing, Monday, the 20th of October 2025, that has not happened yet. What has happened, however, is that both Israel and Hamas have already shown a willingness to push the limits of the truce, most notably in a wave of attacks that Israel carried out on Sunday. According to the Israel Defense Forces, Hamas fighters were the one to break the ceasefire first when militants from the group fired upon Israeli soldiers and killed 2 of them. Hamas denied having ordered the engagement, although Hamas is hardly a credible source and may have only a limited ability to control the most radical among its base of fighters. The Israeli troops had been operating in an area where the ceasefire permits them to be present, since the ceasefire, in its current form, only calls for Israel to withdraw from about 47% of the Gaza Strip. They were the first Israeli troops to be killed since the ceasefire agreement was signed last week. In response, Israel launched a series of strikes across the territory, using both aircraft and artillery to hit dozens of targets that Israel stated were associated with Hamas, including places where field commanders and foot soldiers were thought to be present, multiple weapons depots, and at least 1 tunnel. The death toll from the strikes is claimed upward of 35 at the time of writing, and it is expected to rise further. During the course of the day on Sunday, Israel temporarily and unilaterally suspended the delivery of humanitarian aid across the territory. Although the suspension was lifted after Israel's strikes wrapped up, the incident confirms that Israel is still willing to cut off the flow of aid unilaterally at its leisure to pursue its military objectives. Nor was that round of airstrikes the only time that the ceasefire has come under strain. Shortly after it was handed control of the Gaza Strip, Hamas began a series of internal purging operations, targeting clans that don't bear loyalty to the terrorist faction. Within just days, Hamas claimed to have killed dozens of fighters operating in support of those clans, including a number of men who were executed in the streets of Gaza City by masked Hamas gunmen. After initially suggesting that Hamas had been granted a level of acceptance for its crackdowns, US President Donald Trump threatened that, quote, "If Hamas continues to kill people in Gaza, which was not the deal, we will have no choice but to go in and kill them." On Saturday the 18th, the US State Department announced that it believes Hamas may be planning a, quote, "imminent ceasefire violation against the people of Gaza." The US declined to offer any further details, and unsurprisingly, Hamas claimed that it was planning nothing of the sort. Another point of tension has been Hamas's failure to promptly return the remains of deceased hostages. While Hamas claims that it's turned over all the bodies it has and would need to sift through the rubble across Gaza in order to find the rest, Israel claimed this weekend that Hamas could return up to 5 more bodies immediately, and has not yet done so. Imminent breach. Now, none of these problems by themselves make it impossible for Israel, Hamas, and the international community to salvage this ceasefire. Despite the killings, despite the outstanding points of dispute, this situation can be stabilized, but whether or not that'll happen, that's another story entirely. Each one of those isolated incidents are symptoms of a larger series of problems, and those problems in turn are far from the only roadblocks that Israel and Hamas have to overcome. We can break those roadblocks into 2 basic categories: problems that can cause the ceasefire to deteriorate in the immediate future, and larger systemic issues that make it unlikely that a ceasefire can hold. Now, when it comes to the immediate factors, we'll start with Israel, where the most obvious problem is the fact that Israel is still bombing the Gaza Strip. Yep. By Israel's own account, it was provoked into launching a retaliatory strike, but it's simply not accurate to state that Israel was compelled to respond in that way, or at least that there was anything compelling Israel beyond Israel's own expectations about what it does when it's been attacked. Israel had every opportunity to engage in more limited retaliation, targeting the specific suspected Hamas unit that killed its soldiers, or striking a small handful of targets in the immediate vicinity. Instead, it chose to rain down strikes all across the Gaza Strip. Whether or not Israel supporters may believe that its response was deserved, it was still disproportionate, and thus it was a clear escalation that Israel chose to engage in despite not having to do so. Not only that, but Israel demonstrated that it remains willing to restrict the flow of aid into the Gaza Strip. In a way, that's another escalation. Hamas broke one part of the ceasefire, especially the bit where Hamas and Israel aren't supposed to shoot each other, and in response, Israel broke that same condition and another one by restricting aid. The reason that Israel's manner of response is important here isn't just because this single ceasefire violation is a problem. I mean, after all, in the aftermath, both Israel and Hamas reiterated their desire to stick to the larger deal. The problem is what might happen if this process starts to become routine. Israel cutting off the flow of aid and launching what appeared to be basically unrestricted airstrikes when it's provoked. Should Hamas be provoking Israel? No, absolutely not. But only Israel can choose to either absorb the pain of a Hamas attack in order to work toward a peace, or respond in proportion to whatever's happened, or to respond disproportionately. And Israel's conduct by restricting aid and bombing the Gaza Strip suggests a belief in Jerusalem that this ceasefire can be tested and still hold together. That calculus may well prove to be correct. After all, the United States is Israel's most important backer and has been essential to the ceasefire process, while Israel is the far more militarily powerful fighting force and no longer has to consider the fates of living hostages, meaning that it's Israel that could probably get away with more while still counting on the international community to try and de-escalate. But there's also an acute danger in that way of thinking, because even though the ceasefire deal may have some wiggle room for Israel, there's no way to know which actions would precipitate a return to fighting until that return to fighting has already happened. And if Israel risks stressing the ceasefire to its breaking point, then the same can certainly be said for Hamas. For one thing, Hamas has clearly chosen to interpret the ceasefire as an opportunity to reconsolidate its power inside the Gaza Strip, targeting and killing internal enemies almost as soon as it had the opportunity to do so. Not only does Hamas make what might be a flawed assumption that Israel and the international community won't interpret internal acts as a breach of the ceasefire, but it also signals to Israel and the entire world that its members remain well-armed and highly motivated to fight. Remember, Israel has stated for years now that one of its overarching war goals is to destroy the Hamas organization in its entirety. By sending its fighters out to patrol openly and to engage in gun battles in the streets, Hamas is quite pointedly demonstrating that it has not yet been destroyed. Just as important, Hamas's attempt to gain control of the Gaza Strip implies what many experts on the conflict already suspected, that it does not intend to disarm or give up its authority in Gaza anytime soon. The later stages of the peace deal that Hamas and Israel are working toward would call for exactly that, for Hamas to disarm in exchange for amnesty and for its members to accept that they will never have a place in the administration of a post-war Gaza. Hamas's actions signal the exact opposite, and according to senior officials speaking to Reuters late last week, the group fully intends to maintain control over the Gaza Strip without disarming. Speaking to the outlet, high-ranking Hamas member Mohammed Nazal refused to commit to any disarmament initiative. And that's a problem, not just because it would almost certainly derail efforts to reach a second stage of the ceasefire, but because it risks signaling to Israel that any further negotiations are pointless. If Israel doesn't believe that Hamas has any intent to disarm, then why would Israel remain engaged in the ceasefire process instead of returning to airstrikes, aid cutoffs, or even its ground invasion when that's convenient? And even if Hamas leaders didn't directly order the attack on Israeli troops that precipitated the latest round of airstrikes, there's a larger problem to consider. Hamas's command and control is still devastated in the wake of the conflict with Israel, and it's not clear that they're able to control their field commanders or their individual foot soldiers. The most ideologically extreme members among Hamas ranks may not believe that a ceasefire is in their interests, or may reject the entire premise of a ceasefire on principle. Even if we accept the claim that the fighters who most recently killed Israeli soldiers were acting alone, it only takes a very small number of fighters to carry out a provocative attack, and once they do, Hamas cannot stop Israel from simply assuming that the attack came on the orders from leadership. Just a quick pause to share something with you that we are rather excited about over here. No, we're not asking for donations to fund our counter lawsuit against Somalia yet. Also, probably won't be necessary. Instead, we want to tell you how WarFronts has expanded into a brand new medium. Fronts.co. It's a website. It's not a .com because that was unavailable, and even if available, really expensive. This was expensive enough. So, after launching our newsletter earlier this year, we realized there is an appetite out there for our brand of analysis in the written form. So, we got in touch with some experts, including actual award-winning journalists who agreed to write for us. I know. They did, though. They did. WarFronts grew so fast. And now we're showing you the results. Fronts.co is our subscriber-only website featuring longer-form, in-depth articles on aspects of defense and geopolitics that we feel are getting overlooked. The inner mechanics of Russia's sanctions evasion, how maths can make you a better warfighter. Yes, really. And if you want serious analysis for dangerous times, this Fronts.co, that site, is the place to be. Beyond that, it's also going to be the home of exclusive videos. Twice a week, we'll be publishing bonus WarFronts episodes covering everything we do best, like assessing whether Poland or Russia would win were war to break out tomorrow. All of this is just $5 a month or $50 a year. That's fronts.co, not .com, and nothing on WarFronts is changing. All of the content you love remains here as ever. It's all just extra. And now back to today's video. Systemic strain. So if you zoom out past these immediate inflammatory factors, you can see a whole range of other confounding problems. Again, we'll start with Israel, where, as usual, the politics of Benjamin Netanyahu's ruling coalition simply have to be taken into account. Israel's hard-right political parties, including groups led by Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, have made clear that they expect Israel to continue its war against Hamas until the organization is fully destroyed. They responded to the most recent deaths of Israeli soldiers by reiterating their calls for war, and they've threatened to quit the Netanyahu government outright. If Netanyahu fails to restart the war, then Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are likely to act on that promise. If that happens, Netanyahu's government collapses, he most likely fails to assemble a replacement, and he's left exposed against a series of corruption charges, plus an expected inquiry into the failures of governance that led to the October 7th attacks. Meanwhile, Israel is still awaiting the return of the remains of deceased hostages that we mentioned before. Israel has received 14 sets of remains since the start of the ceasefire, including one body that Israel specifically said was not a hostage, but 15 still remain. Hamas has claimed that the rest of the deceased are buried under rubble, and most likely that's true for at least a few of them. The whereabouts of the others may have been lost because Hamas members entrusted with that knowledge have since been killed. But for Israel, the outstanding issue of the hostage remains would make a return to war more likely in two ways at once. First, Israel insists that Hamas could return more bodies than it has, and further delays could lead to sufficient public outcry that Jerusalem may feel compelled to act. Or if Jerusalem chooses to resume hostilities for some other reason, then it can use the outstanding issue of hostage remains as a pretext to reopen its offensive. On the other side of the equation, the issues that Hamas faces around disarmament go well beyond their desire to maintain immediate control of the Gaza Strip. For Hamas, disarmament means a total concession of defeat, and it also means that Israel could do basically whatever it wishes with both the group's ex-members and the Gaza territory overall. The later stages of the peace deal, laid out by Washington, call for Hamas fighters to receive an amnesty deal. But amidst all the discussions around other outstanding issues, the question of amnesty has been almost entirely ignored. It's highly unlikely that Israel would accept amnesty for Hamas as a precondition for peace, and even if it did, Hamas fighters certainly understand that if they chose to voluntarily relinquish their weapons, they'd have no way to stop Israel from going back on a deal. Just as salient is Israel's insistence that Hamas never be allowed to take part in the civil administration of a post-war Gaza, a condition that Hamas leaders have indicated that they'd refuse to accept. There's also the question of a potential relocation and the threat that some of the more extreme plans for a post-war Gaza, including that whole Riviera of the Middle East thing, could be back on the table as soon as Hamas loses the ability to mount a violent opposition. We said at the start of the episode today, and we'll say it again, we would be very happy to be wrong about everything, as would the many global experts who've looked at this situation and don't believe that a ceasefire can last. But right now, the pressures pushing against a permanent truce in Gaza, they're just too many to count, and the differences between these two sides may turn out to be irreconcilable. If the Gaza Strip can avoid a return to war, it'll be a blessing. But right now, that would also be a major surprise. Thank you for watching.